Hello all, this is the Owl, and today... Oh right, before we get cracking, a few quick things. Don't worry, I know my intros have been getting a bit flabby again. This shouldn't take too long. Firstly, as mentioned previously, Mrs. Owl has recently opened her art commissions in an attempt for us to raise a little bit of extra money. Things right now, well, let's just say they're a bit rough and not getting any cheaper. She does pixel and non-pixel art, OC designs, portraits, animations, backgrounds, avatars, and did both my intro and my owl avatars here on YouTube. Hit her up on her coffee or her business email for a quote. All links, as always, are in the description. Next up, I need to eat a little bit of delicious crow and correct something rather dumb I said in my previous video. As so many of you pointed out, my suggestion that the iconic Scar story might have been inspired by the Kamui attack used by certain characters in the Naruto franchise was pretty idiotic. Uzumaki does indeed predate this part of Naruto, and while Ito might indeed have a case of the galloping crazies, it's not quite at the level where I think he can transcend space and time to make a reference to something that has not actually happened. Well, at least I hope not. On the other hand, I reserve the right to flip it, because I do suspect that Obito and his Kamui attack might be a direct nod to that story, as it does operate on a similar manner, at least from a visual standpoint. Thirdly, this was, as I said, going to be the final Uzumaki video, but the script for the thing ballooned out, so this will end up as a 3-parter, which means that, yes, all 3 will eventually be compiled into a single gargantuan video for all of you artists and people who like to listen to me at work. Finally, please don't forget to submit your questions for the AMA either in the comments section of this video or in the Ask Me Anything channel on the Discord. As requested, we will be leaving it open a little bit longer, with submissions closing 1 week after this video airs. Anyways, on with the show. Our next story is Jack in the Box, and this one, well, as mentioned in the previous video, it is somehow both everything I like about Junji Ito's work, as well as everything that frustrates me about his work, rolled into one, in that the good stuff is really good, but it also ends up a little bit scuffed, at least from my perspective, because of Ito's tendency to leave his stories in the oven a bit too long. What do I mean? Okay, we start out with Kirie, now rocking an attractive bob cut, and one of her friends discussing another student, Mitsuru, who is, that kid. You know, that kid. I'm sure you had 1 or 2 in your class growing up. The kid who would think that it was extremely funny to constantly hide somewhere to startle other students. And no, I was absolutely not that kid. Through most of primary school, whatever lies anyone may tell you, we follow the pair on their way home, discussing some of the changes in the town as of late. In particular, the fact that the dead are no longer being cremated due to the weird spirals in the sky this seems to cause. Instead, all of the town's dead are being buried, which is very unusual in Japan. And, let's be honest here, is most likely more for the sake of setting up the final sequence of this story than anything else. Yes, burial versus cremation is a pretty contentious issue in Japan, and it's something we will get into in just a bit. Of course, the two are walking along when suddenly, mid-graveyard stroll, out jumps Mitsuru, scaring the ever-loving piss out of the two. No, that's in no way funny. But we do get more confirmation that Kirie and Shuichi are indeed a couple, as Mitsuru reveals that he's jealous, and that he wants a cute girl like Kirie, naturally for the sake of surprising others. I think that the Japanese word here is bikuri, which would be somewhere between startling and surprising, but I'm not sure. It's kind of a hard word to translate. Regardless, we then get confirmation that, yeah, this is all kind of a rather gross attempt to force Kirie to like him, or I guess, if she will not like him, to extract negative attention from her as opposed to zero attention. Yeah, dude, nobody likes this sort of behavior, and it's the sort of thing you really should have outgrown in elementary school, to use the American term. Anyways, this continues, Mitsuru popping out of random places to scare her and eventually giving her a gift, which she refuses. He then switches to a genuinely bizarre tack, revealing that, yeah, Mitsuru isn't just annoying, he is legitimately unhinged and jumps in front of a moving car, claiming that her love for him will stop it and, of course, screech honk splat. I probably shouldn't show you the two panels of his mutilated corpse caught in the car's wheel well, but rest assured, it is some graphic stuff. Yeah, for an Ito manga, this can actually be pretty gruesome at times, even by the author's standards. Regardless, this does, Pet Cemetery style, lead to a closed casket funeral, and yeah, okay, I am going to have to oversimplify here quite a bit, but burial of the dead versus cremation in Japan is extremely complicated, and it ties both into the odd Japanese religion, a vaguely uncomfortable fusion of Shinto practices and Buddhism that was supposed to be an enforced state religion, Google it if you want to know more, as well as social class, the very complex and arcane way that land ownership and designation is handled in Japan, and also, I guess now, the increasing number of religious minority individuals living there. To my understanding, traditionally speaking, and we're talking hundreds of years ago, most folks were buried with, for the most part, only the wealthy or noble being cremated and enshrined. But the extremely wealthy or the extremely noble, such as the emperor, were also buried, albeit in a far more elaborate manner. However, since the start of the 20th century, cremation became the norm. Buddhism views it as a way to free the spirit from the flesh more easily, while Shinto is a bit different on this stuff. Yeah, again, very, very complex. Japanese theology is its own thing. All you need to know is that being buried in Japan these days is rare, even for non-Buddhists. Not just because it's really expensive, but due to a lack of allocated burial spaces and a general unwillingness to create more, despite there not exactly being a shortage of land. In fact, there was quite a bit of a kerfuffle recently involving the growing Muslim minority of Japan struggling to find anywhere to bury their dead, as, per their doctrine, this must be done within 24 hours, which would be very hard to accomplish in Japan. Again, as always, free to look into this yourselves more. It's way more interesting and complicated than I can do justice in these silly little horror manga videos. Anyways, sometime later, Kirie is feeling a bit bad at home and thus opens her present. Surprise! It's a jack-in-the-box. That's actually sort of sweet in a really unhealthy way. However, later that night, Kirie hears a crumbling voice behind her while talking to Shuichi on the phone. she turns around and sees that it's this. The Jack-in-the-Box, but now with an awful face. The genuinely creepy looking thing blames her for Mitsuru's death and tells her that he will be coming back for her later on. This is all wonderfully spooky. Again, Ito at his best has a great vintage EC Comics feel. And much like in an EC comic, which I can't find anything about this, but I really do suspect that Ito must have been a fan of these. For some reason, they think that the best idea is to go and dig up Mitsuru's body to make sure he's actually dead. Actually, now that I think about it, this is also a very Kazuo Umezu beat, with Shuichi's plan being to hammer a stake into Mitsuru's heart to ensure that he cannot come back to life, which, yeah mate, but that'll work on most things. They dig up the coffin, gagging at the putrid stink, and as they prepare to open it, the little trap door for the face. Yeah, Japanese coffins are built like this, even the ones for cremation, and for the life of me, I cannot figure out why. All I can find is a truly odd story. See, the coffin is filled with dry ice to stop the unembalmed corpse from stinking as people come to view it before the cremation. And this has led to an epidemic of people leaning over too close, getting a lung full of dry ice fumes, and straight up blacking out on top of the corpse. The things I learn making these videos. But regardless, it suddenly springs open. And narrative causality, what do you think happens next? Yup, Mitsuru's rotting, stitched together face pops out, and worse yet, starts making noises at them while something starts hammering on the coffin from the inside. Bloody hell, that is brilliant. See what I mean? A nearly perfect, almost classically told campfire tale. But yeah, remember when I said that this story is an encapsulation of the stuff I love about Ito, but also the stuff I hate? Well, here's why. In a word, Ito doesn't so much gild the lily as give it so many coats of gilding that it's basically just an unrecognizable lump of metal by the end. First up, the corpse bursts out of the coffin, stands up, and then starts leaping after them. This is almost certainly a nod towards Jiangshi, the iconic hopping Chinese vampires, which, interestingly enough, we did already set up the vampire angle with the stake from earlier. Jiangshi are kind of their own thing, and for some inexplicable reason were, until quite recently, really popular in Japan, with a large number of Jiangshi movies being made. In a nutshell, if a relative died and was buried outside of your hometown, your family could hire a necromancer to reanimate the corpse and lead it home. But if the paper seal was removed from its face, it would go on a rampage. These vampires can also be created by a pregnant cat jumping over your coffin, as well as some other means. However, due to rigor mortis, the corpse can only hop around. And again, you've probably seen this referenced in a ton of Japanese media, for instance, an iconic character from the Darkstalkers series. Regardless, in another series of panels that I probably can't show you on YouTube, the rotting, stitched together corpse continues bounding after them, breaking apart as it goes, spilling guts and organs and dropping limbs, until it's basically just a bouncing torso. And we do get the revelation that its spine has become a powerful spring. What are we doing? Mitsuru has turned into a literal jack-in-the-box. Only, as it so happens, this was all due to a shock absorber from the car becoming wedged into the corpse during the accident, which, yes, gives us our spiral motif yet again. But how did nobody spot that? This is what I mean. Had the story ended with the corpse popping up through the trapdoor, and we later learn about the spring, we would retain the spiral and Jack-in-the-Box theme, and the story would have been kept really simple and really creepy. However, the entire bouncing corpse chase was so frigging comical that it kind of detracts, especially since I had a pounding dubstep song in the background while I was reading the sequence that just made it really funny. So yeah, a pretty good story all told, just scuffed. Chapter 8 brings us The Snail, and this one I'm rather mixed on. I know that for some reason it's another fan favorite and there is indeed some real nightmare fuel in here, but it's also Ito taking his crazy pills, so you'll see. And no, we're not even getting close to maximum Ito here. That will happen in Act 3. Oh, just you wait. Anyway, Kirie and another girl are sitting in class, watching the rain falling outside, and have I mentioned that sometimes Ito's art is just really, really good? Like, not all the time. Sometimes his backdrops can be a little sparse, or his face is way too similar, but wow, does this rainy school day resonate with me somehow. The pair are discussing a weird kid in their class by the name of Katayama, who only seems to come to school when it rains. Sure enough, in he walks, a slow-moving, greasy-looking chap that everyone seems mildly repulsed by, and nobody likes that much. They all tend to make general fun of him, who seems slow, both mentally and physically, and is frequently bullied quite aggressively by a hot-blooded little douchebag called Tsumura. As a prank, Tsumura strips him and drags him into the corridor, where everyone notices a nasty-looking spiral shape on Katayama's oily back, but they don't really make anything of it. Sure enough, the rain continues, and so the kid keeps coming to school, but something seems just off about him. He gradually becomes slower and even weirder looking, with a horrible cone shape becoming more and more visible under his clothing. This continues until one day he slithers into class, having mostly metamorphosed into, well, not to put too fine a point on it, a giant snail. Okay, Ito, the story from here is kind of simple. It's just an ever-escalating sequence of ick, especially when he crawls up onto the side of the school and his eyes begin to protrude on stalks. Yeah, that is grotesque, and it's not even the biggest dose of nightmare fuel in this story, as his parents, quite frankly, understandably no longer want him. The school builds the snail boy a hutch and feeds him leaves, although Tsumura continues to torment Katayama, poking him with a stick. Then Tsumura stops coming to school, only on the outside window. Yeah, okay, now that is actually horrifying. Where the hell did I put those jump scare sound effects again? And from here, the story gets weirder and weirder. If you can believe, Katayama and Tsumura mate and lay eggs, which freaks their teacher out, causing him to stomp on them, and for some reason this also makes him mutate into a horrible snail person. Yes, I'm sure this all means something to Mr. Ito, and that I'm just not on his wavelength, but Bron isn't legal in the country in which I now live. Yeah, Google Bron, you would be surprised at what you can buy over the counter in Japan. Our next story, The Black Lighthouse, is actually one I really dig, although, like so much else in Uzumaki, it's a very strange one. It's also rather Lovecraftian. You'll see what I mean. So, Leading into this, lighthouses are one of those things that a lot of folks are superstitious about, both in and outside of Japan, due to the vaguely unearthly feeling these structures seem to possess, and likely due to their place in maritime history. Japanese superstitions around lighthouses range from them having the ability to cause relationships to be doomed to the notorious Motojima Lighthouse near Hiroshima, one of the most allegedly haunted places in the region, and what I sort of suspect might have inspired this story, at least partially. No, I can't talk too much about Motojima because of the reason it's so notorious, and this is why I'm reluctant to talk about a lot of other haunted or allegedly cursed places in Japan. This is a topic that YouTube is really prickly about right now and does not want discussed on the platform at all. Just think Logan Paul and Japanese forests if you want a hint. Anyway, the lighthouse near town, one night, suddenly begins emitting a spiraling, because of course, incandescent blast of light in bizarre pulses. The responses to this are varied. Kids think it's pretty cool and want to go and investigate, but the adults find it really ominous. A team is dispatched to figure it out, as the light has been out of service for a while, so it really shouldn't be doing this at all. Of course, as per the narrative laws pertaining to horror stories, they are never seen again. Sure enough, night after night, the lighthouse continues to emit those baleful, twisting blasts of light, which not only seem to hypnotize residents, but cause them to act strangely in daylight hours too, wandering around in tiny circles without realizing it, an epidemic that continues to spread. Kirie's little brother, on the other hand, finds the lighthouse absolutely fascinating, and thus, along with his friends, decides that he wants to go in and investigate. They rush in with Kirie in hot pursuit, up the winding spiral staircase, finding more spirals somehow burned into the rock. At the very top she finds, a bunch of charred corpses, the remains of the team sent to investigate the lighthouse. Shortly after, she finds two of the boys huddled in fear and sends them downstairs to safety, but realizes that her brother went up higher, so she heads up herself. At the very pinnacle, she finds him and another boy looking in fear at... what the hell? Okay, so if you've watched The Lighthouse, yes, that amazing and amazingly bonkers surrealist horror film by Robert Eggers, you might know what this is. But for everyone else, well, firstly, go watch The Lighthouse, it is bloody amazing. And secondly, this is something that, at least likely, was once a Fresnel lens. A revolutionary invention designed to distribute and project a bright light over a wide and controlled area, and these things paved the way for optical or luminal technology later on, such as headlamps on cars, film projectors, and are still used today in stuff like solar cookers, VR headsets, and 3D sand printers. They are extremely complex, too much so to really describe here, but in a nutshell, curved glass divided into concentric circles, tumpty mirrors. Regardless, some extreme heat has melted the lens into a spiral pattern, causing that weirdness from earlier. They flee in an attempt to escape incineration by the warped light filling the lighthouse. Yeah, much as Jack in the Box evoked Pet Sematary, this story evokes from a Buick 8, although I guess it could also be the Tommyknockers. It's all very Stephen King anyway. But while Kirie and her brothers get out, his friend is caught and burned up, and the lighthouse continues to pump out that evil energy night after night, likely further corrupting the town. This next story is a two-parter, and thus probably the longest within the pseudo-anthology. And it's also probably the one that is going to need the most censoring. You will see why, because wow, is this one grim. And by the end, turns into probably the second most gross-out, squicktastic story Junji Ito has ever written. Mosquitos starts with Kirie stuck in the hospital after being quite badly burned in the Lighthouse segment, and at the same time, the town seems to be becoming infested with mosquitoes. So yeah, Japan, especially coastal Japan, has huge problems with those bloody things. You might not know this, but Japanese mosquitoes are a bit different to what you'd find in, say, America or the UK somehow. They're more like the big, nasty black and white buggers we get in Africa. They can carry disease and come in huge swarms in the late summer and mid-autumn. The government has tried all sorts of mandates and the like to reduce their spread, from mandatory yard maintenance to straight up paving over swampy areas, but mosquitoes remain a plague, whether you're in the city or the country, likely due to Japan's extremely hot, long, and wet summers. I actually know quite a few foreigners that came over from the West and wound up having quite severe, even painful reactions to Japanese mosquito bites, including huge welts, persistent sores, or even painful bruises. I'm not sure why this would be, and I was fortunate in that I just got bloody itchy. But yeah, if you ever visit Japan in the summer or autumn, you will see what I mean. And don't even get me started on other Japanese creepy crawlies, especially frigging Jorogumo, which have apparently begun to invade the US. Yeah, you all have fun with those things. Anyway, these mosquitoes fly in spiral shapes, which, contrary to most mosquitoes I've encountered in my life, actually put you to sleep rather than the exact opposite, and they then feed on you while you drowse. Her friend comes in and gets her, and they remark on the sheer number of the things around, and also that they've seen them flying in twisting, spiraling columns. We learn that, actually, the mosquitoes are so damn prolific that year that some people have actually become quite ill from exsanguination. For some reason, pregnant women in particular are being targeted, including Kirie's cousin Keiko, who is going to be a big part of this story. Kirie helps her cousin unpack and finds a very strange item in her luggage, wrapped tightly in a towel. Huh? Then bodies begin to be found, drained of blood, except that these are covered with small holes. All while Keiko tells Kirie that she's started to feel better. I wonder what could be going on. Seriously, is it just me, or is there a lot of vampire stuff in this manga? Shuichi comes to visit, and is his usual cheerful self, telling Kirie to check out as soon as she can, as there is something very badly wrong about this hospital and her pregnant cousin specifically, after they are told to share a room. This annoys her a bit, but before Shuichi can elaborate, he is startled by an especially big and especially loud mosquito. In more Extremely subtle foreshadowing, Shuichi sprays the mozzie with bug spray, telling Kirie, right, that only female mosquitoes bite, and then only when they are pregnant with eggs. Of course, while Kirie and the nurse seem mostly irritated, Keiko has an extremely bad reaction to the spray. And I will say this right now. If you think you know where this story is going, you have either read this manga or are probably wrong, because this is the first nearly maximum Junji Ito story in this manga, meaning that Bananas doesn't even start to cover it. That night, Kirie is woken by a loud and unpleasant whine from outside her room. she peers out to see all the pregnant women from the maternity ward walking in unison, all in an eerie trance, and all emitting that hum. Oh right, they're carrying... okay, I don't even know if they make these anymore. And I, quite frankly, had to ask my father what these things are called, but apparently they are called carpenter's drills. Oh crap. Yeah, that was the thing wrapped in the towel in Keiko's luggage. Also, those things are kind of rare. Wouldn't a small knife have sufficed? Yes, mosquito allegory. I'll stop. I cannot believe I actually wrote this into the script, poking holes. But yeah, sure enough, they are drilling holes into the other patients and drinking their blood. And they can also hypnotize people now with their fingers. Wah. Anyways, this prompts a massacre, and they spot Kirie watching and need to silence her, which causes her to flee. But just in time, she remembers the bug spray, and this causes the vampires to flee themselves, and we get a brief epilogue to part 1, telling us that, the husbands of the woman covered it up. Okay? It appears that they are back to normal, and that the reason they were drinking blood was to feed their unborn babies. Is the implication that they were infected by mosquitoes? Yeah, I have no bloody idea. I know that there are some superstitions about spider bites on pregnant women, but I must say I cannot find anything about mozzies. Regardless, don't worry, we are going to get to the weird and disgustingly nasty stuff. Part 2 of the story is titled The Umbilical Cord. Keiko is about to give birth at last, and it turns out that basically nobody believed Kirie about the massacre. The birth eventually does happen, and while Kirie is, I guess, expecting some sort of blood-sucking mosquito person, as, to be honest, so was I, it turns out to be a beautiful baby. Ditto all the other mosquito vampire women's kids. Very cute and very sweet. Kirie is finally able to check out, but on the way she speaks to Keiko and learns that she's named her baby, Makio. Remember when I said that Ito does sometimes go in for cheeky, on-the-nose names for characters that kind of border on being awful dad jokes? Yeah, this is what I mean. Maki means to wrap or roll something, but it can also be used for things that whirl or, well, spiral. For instance, Tatsumaki means tornado. However, after Kirie notices that the babies have huge stomachs all of a sudden, they begin to howl in unison, creating a horrible, piercing sound that immediately starts to drive her insane, and holy crap, yes, I resemble this remark. That sound, man. You know, I'm really starting to wonder if these two stories are Ito working through some of his own anxieties in regards to becoming a father. Once again, I do not disagree. Believe it or not, the sound of babies crying has such a distinct neurological effect on people, especially men, that it is used to torture-proof Navy SEALs. No, I am not kidding. Regardless, the noise drives Kirie to flee, and she falls down a flight of stairs, becoming quite badly injured. Well, at least she was already at the hospital. Anyway, Kirie is forced to stay longer and is surprised to see that dinner includes, in addition to your standard Japanese fare, I can promise you one of those bowls is rice and one of them is miso soup, for instance, is a large plate of vaguely odd looking mushrooms. Mushrooms that taste and have the texture of something closer to meat. And if your brain works the same way mine does, well, firstly, you have my sincere sympathies, and secondly, you might have already guessed part of the twist here and just threw up inside your own stomach. Kirie notes that the mushrooms became a common ingredient in the hospital food, but wisely decides not to partake, despite the staff calling her fussy, which, especially at the time, would have been kind of a big diss. See, turn of the millennium Japan saw a big push towards what would rapidly become referred to as mottainai thinking. Essentially, the movement involved minimizing waste of all kinds, but particularly food, water, power, and fuel. The austere image of the Japanese salaryman or housewife grows quite extensively out of this. The term itself doesn't translate perfectly, but it probably ends up pretty close to "oh, what a waste," and is still commonly said to people who either don't want to eat part of a meal served to them, or, worse yet, throws out food. Regardless, the mushrooms seem to be a big hit with everyone that isn't Kirie, with people getting pretty weird about them, to be honest. Kirie, in a bit of a funk herself, walks past the incubators and here we go. This is where the story takes a turn for the Ito, by which I mean it goes bug nuts, off the rails, insane. She overhears the babies talking about how they miss being in the womb and wanting to go back in, saying that Dr. Kawamoto, the dude who's feeding people those mushrooms, oh dear, will oblige them. Oh hell. And this is where we start getting not just weird, but gross. Really, really gross. You know what? After rereading this script, what follows is so ridiculously, so insanely disgusting, both in terms of the cultural context this will require and the actual narrative beats coming, that if you have any sort of delicate stomach, please just skip this entire next section. Go right on to the next story, which is The Storm. Yes, even telling you why I am saying this in more detail will be TMI. Trust me on it this once, okay? Okay. Okay, so just to reiterate, if you have any sort of phobia revolving around babies, birth, or let's say the byproducts of the latter, you probably shouldn't be here. Kirie overhears more, and apparently Makio, Keiko's kid from earlier, is in the process of being returned to the womb at present, and yeah, I don't like what that implies at all. Then we see this. The reason for the huge bellies on the babies. As she watches, clothing opens and a prehensile umbilical cord emerges, tipped with a wandering, mushroom-like placenta, naturally engraved with spiral designs. Kirie wanders into an OR and finds the doctor surrounded by more placentas growing out of the floors and walls. We get a bit of a monologue about how baby mammals are basically evil, wicked little parasites that survive by means of weaponized cuteness, and that if they weren't cute, life would probably have died out because nobody would tolerate them. This is actually partially true, believe it or not. I'm not going to go too deeply into evolutionary biology today, but baby animals are essentially designed to be adorable and endearing, so their parents won't just abandon them. This is particularly true of mammals, as egg-laying species, particularly reptiles, are something of a mixed bag as far as this sort of thing is concerned. Wait, where was I? Oh right, the good doctor has somehow been cultivating and eating the placentas, ditto serving them to others, and this is where the story gets even more gross. Don't say I didn't warn you. I think that what Ito is alluding to here is the on and off fad or traditional practice of placentaphagia, literally eating the placenta and sometimes the afterbirth. This practice is common in mammalian species as it allows a mother to preserve important protein and nutrition after the physically exhausting birthing process. But, well, I would like to say it's not something that typically occurs in humans, but this practice does actually happen fairly frequently in certain parts of Africa and Asia, primarily China, some parts of India and Tanzania, as well as Vietnam, particularly with traditional medicine consisting of human placenta being kind of popular in more rural areas or amongst older or more traditionally minded folks. However, as so far as the modern West is concerned, well, it's not something historically done all that often, but in more recent times it does seem to be a cyclical on and off fad. Recently, in fact, there has been something of a trend, particularly in more, let's say, hippy-dippy circles, with certain celebrities engaging in the consumption of their birthing byproducts and swearing by their positive effects on recovery, mood, and hormonal stability, despite the science on this stuff being mixed, to say the least. I actually did do a fair bit of reading up here, and while I'm not willing to weigh in on this outside of saying yes, I am not going to tell anyone what they can or cannot do in the privacy of their own home, obviously between consenting adults. I will say that it's pretty frigging nasty. I will also say that the impression I got was that currently the science is leaning towards this having more risks than benefits due to the placenta serving as something of a filter for bacteria. But remember, I am a silly little horror manga creator, not a nutritionist or a pharmacist, so please do not take my word as law on anything of this nature. Now, placentophagy in Japan is something that does seem to happen quite frequently, especially out in the country where traditional medicine is still extremely popular. I mean, hell, where I was living, one of my old students would routinely drink snake blood for virility. However, with Japan being Japan, details on this sort of thing are rather hard to confirm outside of pure anecdote. You can find discussions about this as well as dubious medical products and alleged health drinks that contain placental extracts or reductions, and there are even some impossible to substantiate but impossible to disprove rumors about these extracts coming from dolphins. And yes, I am now probably going to be a vegan for at least a week, because come on, this stuff is nasty. Regardless, I think that this might be one of the core inspirations behind this story, which is, by far and away, the most gruesome and macabre part of Uzumaki. And yet, it's not one I have seen discussed or even talked about that often. Maybe it's because people have attempted to burn it from their memories, as I honestly seem to have done in the past and will likely do after this. And if you thought that we were done with all the horrific crap, what happens next is also incredibly gross, and I can't show you much of it at all because wow, Ito was on some other shit here. We see that the doctor, not to put too fine a point on it, has sliced Keiko's belly and ostensibly her womb open and put the baby back in her, allowing it to reattach that prehensile placenta and umbilical cord, and then sewed her messily back up. However, this causes her to turn into a mutant creature with a long, barbed umbilical cord for a tongue that drains the doctor down to a mummy and then proceeds to chase Keiko into the placenta fields, where it winds up wiping out the people seemingly now addicted to them. Ha, phew. Things were actually getting bloody harrowing back there for a second. I was honestly relieved when we were back to silly-looking monsters eating people. And you know what? I think I'm nearly done for the day, because I always forget that this story exists and it always blindsides me. Let's move on. our final story for the day, and one that is fortunately not the umbilical cord, because holy crap was that unpleasant, is the storm. An indeterminate time later, marked only by Kirie's slightly longer hair, we see her and a wan-looking Shuichi together on a beach. Yeah, believe it or not, Japan has phenomenal beaches, both on the west coast and the lower east coast. Suddenly, as a distinctive howling sound is heard, Shuichi dashes back into town, shrieking that a typhoon is coming, with everyone looking at him as if he'd gone crazy. However, naturally, he was 100% right. The wind begins to whip up, while Kirie heads out trying to reach him. It then escalates more and more, forcing her to retreat. She realizes that the storm has, in fact, settled right over the town and seemingly her house in particular, surrounding them in a wall of whipping, howling, destructive wind. Typhoons are, much like earthquakes, both a frequent and a semi-serious threat in Japan, but something that locals, especially those living on the coast, have just sort of learned to live with. And yeah, I am not kidding when I say these can be bad. We had 2 absolute bulldozers come through when I lived there, and Ito must have endured some of the really bad ones in his lifetime, including the forest typhoon of '83 that left over 30 dead, thousands homeless, and tons of damage to infrastructure. We then get some weirdness, where Kirie keeps hearing the storm calling her name, but on waking, it becomes apparent that the storm is now fixed over the town, completely cutting it off from the outside world. Well, it can't be worse than Under the Dome, I guess. Shuichi tells her that the storm is somehow obsessed with her and that it's dangerous for her to be out and about. And sure enough, as if prompted, the storm begins throwing all sorts of stuff around and messing things up, presumably trying to kill Shuichi. Another woman comes to help, but the storm grabs her, thinking she's Kirie, then literally spits her out once it realizes, causing her to go splat almost comically. They take cover under an underpass, which, yes, if I recall, is supposed to be a really bad idea for some reason. And then after it, no joke, sees them with its eye, they scramble down into the storm tunnels to escape it. But it sucks them back out along with the water, and they, fall to their apparent deaths, but are later fished out of Dragonfly Pond, which also allegedly ate the typhoon. Yeah, this will be partially explained later, but it's still just so odd. Anyways, next time we will finish off Uzumaki, as the final act of the book is, believe it or not, where we hit maximum Ito. Although there are actually some cool horror sequences scattered in amongst the banana cream pies. That, however, will have to wait. Before we finish for the day, I just want to say, as always, a massive and heartfelt thanks to my wonderful patrons, without whom I would not be able to keep making these. Cheddar, Crazy, Question Man 6, Starwin Marwin, Hunting for R2D2, Kel Core, Opinion Custard, Piece of Yeast, Ranger Danger, Rose Montgomery, Wargle, Be Empress, Inukie Koji, Cheshire Quill, Endymion, Aaron Arnold, Jake, Just Zero, Lance Goebel, Lucian, Polite Crow, Rafferty, Simone, Jake Ramsey, and Squid. I also want to give an especially big thanks to our Owlbard patron, Javis. That is just so generous, mate. If you want to help us out by supporting this channel, feel free to head over to our Patreon, or you could leave one of those weird super thanks things. I still do not fully understand how that works. If you become a patron, however, you will also earn early videos, exclusive content, Discord perks including a patrons only channel, and some other fun stuff. If you want to commission some art from the amazingly talented Mrs. Owl, you could hit her up on the Discord or her business email or her coffee. All links, as always, are in the description. Otherwise, take care my friends, and I will see you all next time. This is the Owl signing off.